My name is Ken Hall, and I'm a community ambassador for Access Fund, a national organization whose mission is to lead and inspire the climbing community towards sustainable access and conservation of the climbing environment. I'm also a crag ambassador at Donation Rocks in Huntington County for South Central Pennsylvania Climbers, one of 3 major LCOs or local climbing organizations in PA. I met Rob Schorr of Climbers for Bat Conservation at an Access Fund Summit meeting a few years ago and knew right away I wanted to get involved. Fast forward to today, I, along with Dana Caracciolo of Eastern Pennsylvania Alliance of Climbers, or EPAC, have put together this talk featuring Rob, Greg Turner from our Pennsylvania Game Commission, Shawn Davis of Slippery Rock University, and 2 representatives from our Pennsylvania Department of Natural Resources to chat bats. With that, let me introduce our distinguished panel in order of their appearance. Greg Turner is Pennsylvania's state mammologist and supervisor of the endangered non-game mammal section for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Among duties to other mammal species, he has been researching and monitoring Pennsylvania's bat population for the past 18 years and began surveying and researching white nose syndrome in 2007 when it was first identified in New York. Greg works on the front lines of bat conservation and has pioneered several techniques now used around the country to monitor hibernating bats and to minimize the effects of white nose syndrome. He's also active in banding peregrine falcons on cliff nests and rappelling into caves and mines for bat surveys. Pretty cool. Dr. Shawn Davis is an assistant professor in the Parks, Conservation, Recreational Therapy Department at Slippery Rock University here in PA. He currently teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in ecology, environmental education, environmental communication, environmental grant writing, and outdoor leadership. He does a lot. His current research involves a collaborative project with rock climbers, land managers, and bat biologists to discover bat roosting locations in crack and crevice environments. And of course, Rob Schorr is a conservation biologist and research associate at Colorado State University and the director of Climbers for Bat Conservation. His research focuses on population ecology of rare and lesser known mammals like bats. He has monitored little brown bat colonies using radio frequency identification tags and collaborated with rock climbers to study bat roost use. He develops projects for undergraduate students and mentors the students through their own conservation biology research. Way to go, Rob. Also joining us from DCNR are Ara Stauffer, a wildlife biologist who works mostly with non-game species management on state forest lands, and Matt Crosby, the Bureau of Forestry's non-motorized recreation forester. Pretty impressive panel, wouldn't you say? So, okay, let's get started. Greg Turner, take it away.
Probably helps if I unmute myself. Sorry about that. It never fails, right? There's always one. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be here today and really excited to see so many people excited about bats. Bats are a really unique critter. And today I'm hoping to impart some of that knowledge on you with bats. And we'll just jump right in. So of all the mammal species on the planet, there's about 5,000 or so of them. About a third of them are rodents and a quarter of them are bats. So bats are the second most diverse group of mammals on the planet. And they're found everywhere on the planet except in Antarctica. So they're really diverse. They have a really diverse set of feeding and roosting characteristics. We have bats that can pick off minnows out of the water, eat frogs, some that eat birds. We have a lot that are insectivorous, of course, here in North America. and so on and so on. Of course, everybody probably thinks of vampire bats too. We do have those, but they're in Central America, not here in North America. So bats are a long-lived animal. They can live to be about 35 to 40 years old, and they have one pup a year, so they're really slow reproducers. And they are, of course, our only flying mammal. So bats here in our area in Pennsylvania, they hibernate for about half of the year. So they're actually today, tomorrow, this is the time of year where they start coming out of hibernation as spring comes. But they spend about half of the year underground in hibernation, and they spend about half of it above ground. And when they're above ground, they're reproducing and foraging. And for us, they're foraging mostly on moths and mosquitoes and other types of insects. So the general life cycle of a bat, if you want to just kind of boil it down, is that this time of year in spring, they come out of hibernation and they have to migrate, specifically the females, who will aggregate to form what we call a maternity colony. And that's where they're going to collectively raise their young together. So female bats are going to become pregnant as soon as they come out of hibernation. So they're really unique in the fact they have what we call delayed fertilization, where they mate in the fall, the female goes straight into hibernation and keeps that sperm viable all winter long while she hibernates, so that she doesn't have to spend an ounce of energy in the spring when energy is really critical, and she can fly straight to that maternity site and start gestating that young and rear that young. So it takes about 80 days. Most bats have one pup per year. Some of the larger ones do have two. And it takes about 30 days for a young pup to grow up and actually start learning to fly. And they're not very good at it when they start, but they can start flying and feeding on their own at that point. That gives them just a little over 2 months to put on enough body fat in order to spend a whole 6-month hibernation period underground. And that's not a lot of time, and they put on maybe about an ounce or so of fat. So bats, like I said, are diverse. They provide a lot of really cool ecological services. There's a lot of different niches for them. We have some that are pollinators, and of course, the most famous one of that is if you like margaritas, you can thank bats. They are the sole pollinator of the agave plant. They spread a lot of seeds around. They eat a lot of different insects. One of my favorite bats is the pallid bat down there in the bottom left. Those guys will eat all kinds of nasty, venomous scorpions and centipedes. And then as far as our food goes, you know, I mean, these guys are pollinating bananas and plantains and avocados and all kinds of nuts. So they're really, really valuable to us from that point of view. They're also really valuable to us from that insectivorous point of view. So some of the estimates, and you'll see variations on this depending on the source, but we generally say that bats can eat somewhere around 4,500 insects per night. And when they're above ground for half a year, you're looking at 800 to 900,000 insects that each individual bat is eating and consuming each year. So you can just imagine how a colony of 300 or 500 bats living around your home in a barn or in a bat box would be advantageous to you. And it's another reason why we would call them the farmer's friend, because they're saving them a lot of money in pesticides and crop damage. But considering the vast majority of our bats are actually living in the woods, and they're living in trees where the bark is falling off, whether it's from a broken branch or a lightning strike or whatever, those bats are probably playing a very integral role in our forest health. It's not something we have really well measured and understood, but a large number of these bats are what we call gleaners, and they can pick off centipedes and caterpillars and spiders right off of the leaves, as well as the ones that we call hawking, which is via photo of a bat eating a moth there, just picking them off right out of thin air. And they eat a whole diversity of insects, right? They're going to eat beetles, they're going to eat things like dunflies and mayflies. and they're going to eat a lot of moths. So there's a lot of moths that cause crop damage. And there was a paper that came out that basically estimated bats save farmers about $74 per acre. And in Pennsylvania, one of the reporters put this together and showed that we're looking at about $278 million in crop damage annually is saved in Pennsylvania alone. And we're looking at billions of dollars nationwide. In fact, when I give these longer talks to the public, I often show slides of Doppler radar in Texas picking off millions and millions of bats coming out of some of these caves. And there's so many that their heat signature is picked up by that radar. And they fly out every night eating these migratory moths that come up from Central America and would be causing a lot of crop damage to our corn and cotton and other species. Now, bats have faced a long series of threats from people throwing pollutants and garbage into the sites where they hibernate to some of the old practices of clear cutting. And so if you're living in a tree, obviously that's not very advantageous to you. In some places of the world, they're hunted and eaten. And in other places, a lot of places, even still places in North America, mine reclamation is legally allowed to entomb these bats. And so you have bats that are underneath the ground, either raising their young or hibernating in the winter, and they just get sealed in and buried in. One of the things in Pennsylvania is we seem to run over a lot of species. We find a lot of roadkill, and bats are no exception. Pesticides are sprayed directly on the food source of bats. And if you were to look at papers, looking at the amount of chemicals and other things that are in bats, the list is really, really long, pages long. So they're exposed to a lot of things that we ourselves would never want to consume. And when we find good sites in the winter, we like to protect those and gate those. And then there are people who will break into those sites. And so we have a lot of what we call cave breaches. And then wind turbines is one of the more recent threats as well, where in Pennsylvania, we're looking at about 25 bats per wind turbine are killed each year. And unfortunately, those being killed now are survivors of white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome is a fungus, and it's invasive, exotic. It came from somewhere in Eurasia. And when it came in 2006, 2007, all of our bats in North America that hibernated were vulnerable and very susceptible to it, and it caused the death of millions and millions of bats. Just to give you a very brief idea of what that looks like, this is one site in particular that we've monitored for a long time. We've been managing that site, it's gated, and once it was gated, the bat population just increased annually to the point where we were probably at about 35 to 40,000 bats when white nose hit it. And within a year, that site went down to about 150 bats from 35,000. And then it hit a low of 70 bats a couple of years later and has been slowly recovering from there. And that is not uncommon. Pretty much every site that we monitor, we see these just really sharp declines. A lot of sites we monitored actually went to 0. So having a site that only went to 70 was one of our better examples, as scary as that is. And we're looking at an overall decline in bats from white nose syndrome in Pennsylvania of about 99%. So looking at the 3 species of bats in Pennsylvania, the 9 species, we have 2 different guilds. One we call cave or hibernating bats, one we call migratory bats. These 3 bats are what we call migratory bats. They don't hibernate typically. Once in a while, we'll find them in hibernation sites, but for the most part, the females especially are going to mate in the fall as they move south. They're kind of in Canada and the upper part of the US, and then in summer, and then in the winter, they migrate down south. And so they're going to raise a pup down south, in January, February timeframe, move back north and do that again up here. And so we have the silver-haired bat, the red bat, which is very charismatic and stands out. And then we have the hoary bat, which is our largest species of bat. We're probably looking at about a 16-inch wingspan on the hoary bat. As far as our cave bats, what you're going to notice here is a lot of state and federal listings here. So prior to white nose syndrome, we had one federally listed bat. That was the Indiana bat. The Indiana bat is down here in the lower left corner with the yellow band on there. We had maybe about 1,000 Indiana bats before white nose syndrome came. We're now, and that's as far as our counting of winter colonies, we're now down to about 6 or 8 Indiana bats. It kind of depends on the winter, right? We've been fluctuating. And yeah, you probably heard me right. We're down to like single digits. As far as some of the other species, on the top left, we have the red-banded bat there. That is a little brown bat. That bat was our most common bat before white nose syndrome. We have no idea how many there were, probably tens of millions. We're now down to thousands of those. This species is up for federal listing consideration right now. We have the big brown bat, which is a bat that's not affected as much as the others and doing fairly well in comparison. The tricolored bat here with that really bright pink forearm and jet black wing. This species is also under consideration for federal listing now. We have on the bottom right the small-footed bat, which is one we'll talk about in a minute. Nice jet black face there from ear to ear. That is a state threatened bat. And then we have the northern long-eared bat, which was recently listed as federally threatened, I think in 2015, and is now under consideration and proposed to become federally endangered. So a number of these bats will actually use rocks. And so what we have, just a little bit of talk on rocks and bat use. We're looking at 2 different seasons. So one, we will have the species, the small-footed bat. They love using rock at least all summer, if not all year. And they will actually raise their young, and is probably one of the most common species in Pennsylvania that a climber would encounter. So, you know, bats don't flush as readily as, say, a peregrine falcon or a hawk or a raven that's on a cliff face. As you approach, they're probably going to fly off and start squawking at you. The bats are going to sit pretty tight. They're pretty cryptic, and they're not going to fly out quite as readily. And so, of course, that does bring in a slight risk of being bitten. And it's only point I'm going to bring up on that is there is a concern with rabies. So if for some reason you stuck your hand in a crack and it was bitten by a bat, you would want to go get rabies shots, because there is no coming back from that if it develops in you. So, so that would be just one word of advice on that. And as I said, they're very cryptic. This is just a quick little slide of a couple bats hanging out in this crack. You're more likely to hear them squeak as you move past them. As they crawl over each other or bump into each other, they're going to squawk at you or the other bats there. And if I zoom in a little bit here, you can see the actual 2 bats here. For those of you that can see my mouse, you can see an eyeball right here, and then a little bit of the nose. And then you have another bat here. This is its ear and a nose against the ground this way. So they're actually facing opposite directions, these 2 bats, but there's 2 of them just kind of hanging out in that crack there. We'll also see bats using rocks in the wintertime. And we actually, when COVID came, we stopped all bat work for fear that we would make COVID endemic in wildlife. So we halted all bat work almost nationwide, I believe. And unfortunately, it is in some of our wildlife like mink and deer, but bats have remained COVID free. But during that year, we actually did a lot of surveying at a whole variety of sites, looking for what we call non-traditional use. And we found at least 4 different species using these cracks and crevices and sometimes these alcoves, where they can get a little bit deeper in and away from the colder temperatures in winter. And so finding them in winter or late fall or early spring using these cracks is quite possible as well. And you're more likely to find a variety of species this way, as opposed to more than likely small-footed bats. And so I'll bring it home with just a couple little thoughts I had on ways that those of you interested in bat conservation can help. So if you're on a dedicated route and you happen to know and mark that there's a maternity colony of small-footed bats there, obviously avoidance is the biggest thing. When they're there with their young, every little bit of disturbance, really detracts from their ability to use the area. A lot of times when they're disturbed, the mothers will grab the young and fly away to a different place that would be probably less ideal for them. And there's always the risk too that when those young get a little too big, the mothers often crash and burn. They're not able to carry that extra weight, and then they have to lose that young. They're not able to get it to a nice safe location. A lot of those places, and if you think back to that photo I just had with the small-footed bats in the crack, there's a lot of lichens and other natural resources, and they're holding a lot of moisture. And so avoidance of removing those natural components on these cliff faces, it can be very valuable to those species. And if you ever look or see later today other photos of bats hanging out, like I said, they're just really cryptic, and they're using those colorations of leaves and lichens to blend in. Obviously, I think one of the big things with climbers for bat conservation is reporting any sightings you have. We're always eager to know where those sites are at. And if we find any maternity colonies, we have a program called the Appalachian Bat Count, where people count bats for us once to twice a year. And that gives us a nice little trend of how the bats are doing. And this one's a little bit more odd, but I know some of the climbing areas in the northeastern part of the state are around areas with a lot of coal mines. But we're always interested in finding sites where bats may be spending their winter. And so if you're ever out in the fall and you're seeing a bunch of bats at dusk and there's mine openings there, we'd love to know about those as well. And I think with that, I'm looking to pass it on here. So I'm going to stop sharing. And if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those at the end.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was really informative. Really loved that. So next up, we have Shawn Davis from Slippery Rock University. You want to take it away, Shawn?
Sure thing. Thank you, Ken. Let me just get this slideshow to presentation mode. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for having us out here. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Climbers for Bat Conservation and a little bit of how it started and the whole communication and collaboration piece that we've developed for this. So I'll give you a little bit of our history in Climbers for Bat Conservation. This all started in Colorado in 2014 when Rob Schorr, who you'll hear from a little bit later this evening, as well as Bernadette Kuhn and myself, got together, and Rob had this question of how many bats are out there in cracks and crevices. He was hearing some stories about some, but he didn't have any really good, reliable reports. And the reason being is that a lot of the cracks and crevices that these bats roost in are hard to reach by ordinary biologists or others who don't have a climbing background. So we decided that it would be necessary to get climbers involved in this collaborative project in order to find out more about roosting bats and bats that habitate these different cracks and crevices. So Rob Schorr and Bernadette Kuhn and myself got together with folks in Northern Colorado. We worked with the NOCO, or the Northern Colorado Coalition of Climbers, and we got them together with a number of the bat biologists in the area, as well as the land managers, to see if we could bring these different groups together to help in monitoring and conserving these bats. at these different resources. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we were conserving the recreational pursuits of these areas as well. So that's just a little shot there of the Poudre Canyon. They have a good climbing site, which the NOCO climbers frequent a lot. It's a beautiful place, but that's the kind of environment where all of this started, and we got the different folks together at Colorado State University, where we all were at the time. So we had a couple goals of this project starting out. One is that we wanted to get more information about where these crevice roosts were and how we could understand a little bit better of the crevice or bat roosting ecology in these areas. So we did have that biological piece of information we were looking for, but we also want to develop this mutually beneficial collaboration with not only bat biologists, but with the climbing community and land managers. Bernadette Kuhn and myself came into the project being avid rock climbers. Rob is now an avid rock climber since starting this project. So we saw both sides of this issue, and we wanted to make sure that it was a true collaboration that had benefits for everyone involved. We also wanted to empower climbers as ambassadors for bat conservation. We found that climbers and bats have a lot in common, and they're both fascinating things that both do. So we wanted to see if there was that synergy there and to empower climbers to do that. We also wanted to develop a model for collaboration. So when we started this in Fort Collins, we didn't know that we were hitting on something that was going to be bigger. But as you'll see, we've expanded this project to Kentucky, and now we're looking to hopefully start a chapter of Climbers for Bat Conservation in Pennsylvania as well. So through this, one of the ways that we brought these groups together was in a process called the World Cafe. And the World Cafe is really designed to bring different groups of people from varied backgrounds together to share and benefit from that knowledge. What you're seeing below the World Cafe process writing there is called graphic recording. So this is about a 14-foot long poster, more or less, that we had a graphic recorder come in and pretty much took graphic notes of all of the conversations that were taking place. So she puts all of the context of our meeting in visual form for everything that we talked about. And so this was the poster that came out of that, and I'm going to try to share that with everyone as well, so you can see some of the details from our first meeting. How the World Cafe process works is it's designed just like it sounds, like a cafe. It's based on the knowledge that a lot of great ideas and innovations happened in cafe culture. And one of the reasons that this did occur is because the cafes were mixing places for a number of different people from all different kinds of backgrounds to share and come up with new ideas. And so essentially what we did is what you would do in a World Cafe scenario is you would have a room that would have many different cafe tables with about 4 seats each. And people would sit at the different tables, and you would go through 3 successive rounds of questioning. And in between each question, you would move tables to a different table host. And so this allowed for a lot of different mixing of people. This also ensured that all the climbers didn't sit together and talk about what climbing and bat conservation meant to them. And then you had a table of bat biologists over here and land managers over here. It mixed everyone up so you could hear everyone's opinions and thoughts and concerns regarding this collaboration. So you would discuss these different powerful questions for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then you'd switch tables. And at the end, we would harvest all of the different knowledge that we gathered from the World Cafe meeting. So some of the big questions that we came up with in our World Cafe, or the initial one, was first finding those touch points of what's important to the different participants about bats, climbing, and/or conservation. So everyone coming to this meeting had a certain passion, but hopefully some of those passions overlapped to bats and conservation as well as climbing. And we found that many people did have those overlapping concerns and passions. Well, the second question that we discussed was what challenges might there be for a collaboration such as this? And so that gave us some ideas of some things that we needed to be careful of and some things that we needed to potentially watch for so that we could make sure that the collaboration stayed mutually beneficial. And then finally, we talked about how we could use our unique talents to bring this collaboration to fruition. And so that gave us a lot of different ideas for moving the idea of bats or climbers for bat conservation forward. That's a picture of our initial World Cafe that was held in a building at Colorado State University called the Powerhouse, which was recently renovated, but was a great space to get people together to talk about all of these different questions. You also note that those tables are designed in kind of a cafe situation in which you have paper on them. There's markers to draw different ideas and connect different ideas with. And we use some really giant Post-it notes as well to kind of collect ideas and post on the wall for similar ideas. So it's a meeting that's not like a typical meeting. There's usually a lot of fun. People laugh a lot and compare and get a lot of different ideas going. So some of the emergent issues that came out of our initial meeting. One of the big issues that came out was that climbers feared that the information collected may be used to close access to certain climbs. And one of the things that we continually return to is that we're not out there to close climbing areas. In fact, the collaboration, we want to make sure that we can keep as many climbing areas open and keep climbers participating, because the only way we get data for Climbers for Bat conservation is through climbers. So we want to make sure that when we say that the organization is mutually beneficial, that it truly is mutually beneficial to all those involved. We also received a lot of innovative ideas to collect the roosting data, because we were pretty much starting from scratch and didn't really know how climbers could collect this different data that's out there. And then we also got ideas to gather more participants and share the project further. You can see there in the scene, that's Karina Mullen. She's from Converse Sketch, which is a company that does a lot of graphic recording and facilitation. And she did that mural that captured all of our conversations from that day. So one of the things that came out of this and moving forward was outreach, and how can we get this idea out to others in the climbing community. So we decided that we would host a number of free climbing nights at our local climbing gyms. And so we paid free entry for people to come in there. We even supplied pizza for the climbers there. And then we just would talk with climbers as we could, as we were climbing and as they were off climbs, of course, to discuss Climbers for Bat conservation, how they could potentially get involved. We gave multiple presentations to climbers and wildlife organizations. I really have Rob to thank for that. He really did a lot of presentations out in Colorado and way beyond to climbers and other biologists. And Rob was instrumental in this piece too for doing a bat survey with climbers. The first one was held outside of Castlewood Canyon State Park, where it was a local climbing area that we got a lot of climbers out to do a bat survey so they could see and observe the different species of bats that we were looking to conserve. We also had some different revelations in data collection from this meeting. So one of the things that came out was if we could collect this data easily by iPhones and apps. And so originally we developed an iNaturalist project. If many of you are aware of iNaturalist, it's a cell phone or computer-based program in which you can note down and log different species as you find them. And it links to a big community of naturalists who help to identify and also add different observations of species that exist in nature. And we also created mail-in postcards for those areas that didn't have cell service and couldn't potentially receive some of the different reports when we wanted climbers to report in about the different bats that they saw in some of these different areas. And we distributed those to climbing gyms and stores. So finally, in sharing the project, the climbers had a lot of great ideas of how we could reach different climbers and share our project out. One thing that first came out was they said we needed to do better marketing and brand kind of this idea of Climbers for Bat Conservation. So we had a logo competition, which one of the, I think he was president of NoCo Climbers actually won. He was a great artist. He actually designed the Climbers for Bat Conservation image that you see down there in our original website. We did create a Facebook page. We developed the website through Colorado State University, and our original website image or home screen is down there below. And then we also posted pamphlets, posters, postcards at climbing gyms and stores. And again, these were all our just original ideas that came out of this first meeting for Climbers for Bat Conservation. Rob is going to also tell you in just a moment how that has blossomed and really taken off in a lot of other great new and beneficial directions as well. Finally, one of the things that we did set out to do as we went through the Climbers for Bat Conservation World Cafe is we felt that we really hit upon something that works. We were getting climbers, land managers, and bat biologists together to help conserve bat populations, and everyone was benefiting from this process. So we want to take this World Cafe idea on the road and start different chapters of Climbers for Bat Conservation. So recently, we were in Kentucky in 2019, where we hosted a World Cafe with the Red River Gorge Climbing Coalition. And this allowed us to further refine data collection needs and techniques. It also kind of came up with this idea that each of these areas should have a local liaison or rock climbing ranger in those climbing areas to kind of facilitate some of the Climbers for Bat conservation work. And then finally, it validated the World Cafe process. Just moving off the successes that we had in Colorado, we were able to connect with a lot of climbers, and we started getting a lot of reports of bats in these areas after having this World Cafe. So that's kind of where we were and a little bit of where we've headed as far as these different conversation methodologies, but I'd like to turn it over to Rob Schorr at this time.
Do I have to wait for you to stop sharing, Shawn, before I try?
Yeah, you should be good now, Rob.
Okay. Hopefully you all are seeing a slideshow now. All right. Thanks, Shawn, for the intro, and thanks, Greg, for the background on the bats. And thank you, Ken and Dana, for putting this all together. Is that, as Shawn alluded to, is that I've done a lot of these talks because in the age of COVID and the age of challenging finances, it's tough to be in front of all the climbers that we want to talk to. So I really cherish these opportunities to chat with climbers and biologists from all over the world. He was even able to give a talk last month to people in the UK. So I'm going to take you through I'm going to revisit some of what Greg and Shawn said, but I'm going to take you through kind of where we've been over the last 8 years. You know, 2014 doesn't feel like 8 years ago with everything that's happened, but it actually was. So my job is trying to take you through where we are now and give you a glimpse of how the idea has kind of progressed since then. So Greg did a great job of kind of displaying the catastrophic loss that the bat populations have been experiencing in North America. I want to add some poignancy to that because it's a little bit challenging in some areas to detect the kind of loss that we have had. Out where you all are, those cave and mine roosting bats that were overwintering, it was really dramatic to see the kind of loss, especially in those graphs that Greg was showing, but the actual visualization of those was difficult to not detect. But in the West, the concentration of bats in hibernacula is a little less concentrated and a little more disparate. Is that finding locations where you can monitor this kind of decline gets a bit more challenging out here. And so the idea that Shawn was alluding to when Bernadette and he and I were chatting way back when was, how would we ever detect the kind of loss that they're seeing from white nose syndrome in the East out here in the West? So who should we be talking to? And so it was from authors that the climbers in the audience are probably much more familiar with than I was back then, but both of these personalities are have gained in notoriety, especially Alex in some of the movies he's been in recently. But in their books about climbing on El Capitan and Yosemite, they were talking about this decades ago. Observing bats in large numbers emerging from cracks on these rock walls was not new to them. And so this resource had existed for quite a while. And so it just took us a while to figure out who should we be talking to about where we should be looking. I'd done bat surveys for quite a while and knew that they were roosting along cliffs, but I was on the ground just pointing up. To have people who actually got to see them at those elevations, at the cracks and roosts they were in, was phenomenal to me. I tell climbers is that I'm a bat biologist, and they see bats more often than I do. So where we are now is Shawn set the stage really well for how this was developed, but we actually are an organization. Climbers for Bat Conservation is now an organization at Colorado State University. And our mission is just as Shawn kind of outlined, is that we still want to access to information and develop that collaboration between rock climbers and land managers, biologists, all with the expectation that this partnership only exists through that collaboration, is that we're here to collect those data, but make sure it's shared with the community of people who have provided it so that it can be used for conservation and can be celebrated. Without those data contributions from climbers, we don't exist. We don't learn about how bats use these landscapes that biologists are just hungry to know about. And thankfully, that's matured to the point where climbers and bat biologists are tackling management issues. We knew these issues may exist, but there's an interest in both parties from addressing them. And that's been really exciting. And the last two pieces here is what we always expected, at least me as a biologist always expected to get out of this, is I want to learn about how bats use habitat in order for us to understand where we should be focusing our conservation attention, but also find bat populations if they start experiencing some kind of decline, is we would know where that's happening. All the logos on this slide have in some way helped us do that. Access Fund has been instrumental in sharing our project and providing the kind of partner that climbers recognize and trust, and that's been huge for us. Their name alone has opened so many doors for us, and so I always want to make sure we thank them. But both Petzl and a host of US, state and national wildlife management agencies have been instrumental in providing funding for that. So where we are now, for the data that's been coming in, again, we're 8 years in, and we have 170 records from 18 states, British Columbia in Canada, and 7 countries. That includes Kenya, Bulgaria, Norway, Sweden, Wales in the UK, and I think I'm missing one. Oh, maybe I'm just counting Canada again there. And those records come from climbers and observations of one bat, like you see here, a lot of pictures of just one individual, but we've had climbers report where they've seen thousands of bats come out of a roost, and it's tough to count bats as they emerge in mass exodus, but those could be hundreds to thousands that'd be worth us revisiting and filming to understand what those populations look like over time. And all the pictures you see here have been provided by climbers or bat researchers. The 2 records we have from Pennsylvania, and Greg, yes, I'm going to be tapping on your door shortly to hear about those records you talked about in your talk. But we have a record from a bridge support near Pittsburgh. So I guess climbers are climbing some of these bridge supports and they saw bats up there. And Ken provided the one we have from Donation Rocks, but I think there's a couple of that have been in that area. Those are the passive ways we've collected data, but we've also found that we can actively look for where bats are roosting. And we've done a couple of climbing surveys. I'll tell you about one where we've paid or partnered with climbers to go out looking for bats and using endoscopic cameras to peek into cracks where bats are roosting. And they've been pretty productive. The other thing we've always wanted to do is once climbers submit those records is we need to follow up and go back there to find out what those look like. So we'd really like to have a team that would be able to do that. I tell climbers that and they get really excited. So I'm going to tell you about some of those collaborations as they exist today. The issue that Shawn mentioned that we experienced from our first meeting that came up as a conservation management issue was, all right, if climbers provide data, what does that mean for our access to those routes? And Greg alluded to this too, is that the issue is I think most climbers saw it was related to how their experiences were with raptor closures. And we see that bats have a much different behavioral response to how the proximity between climbers and bats changes their behavior. And although there could be some behavioral responses, most often those bats just tuck in deeper and watch what's happening. If you saw on the first slide of mine, there was actually a cam from a climber, and there's a bat behind that cam looking out. So even the placement of a device that's for security didn't cause that bat to flee. It just hung out and kind of watched what was going on. The other thing that plays in our favor is that climbers tend to avoid where they know bats exist. We've had 3 records from climbers of the same flake in El Dorado Canyon in Colorado where they know bats exist. And they all say, oh yeah, we know exactly where it is. We climbed to the right of that. So knowing that you have a population like that that persists over time is great information. Knowing that it can persist and climbers avoid it on purpose is even better. The other issue that we knew was going to come up is in regards to white nose syndrome, is what relationship is there between white nose syndrome and climbing? And to be honest with you, so much climbing in the US is done in environments where it's too warm for this fungus to thrive, is that we don't think there's a huge conflict for outside climbing and the spread of this disease. However, there is a bit of climbing that happens underground. And so we've asked climbers to treat the recommendations for decontaminating their gear in a similar way they would if they were cavers. So if you go underground, make sure to decontaminate that equipment before you go to another place underground, so there isn't the possibility of taking that fungus to another location, because this fungus can exist even when the bats aren't there and can be transmitted to other locations and infect other bats. And you kind of see the dramatic effect that has on populations. The other issue that came up is that as climbing expands, we've seen some areas here in the West that have undergone some real increases in development. Is that what does it mean to be climbing at the opening of caves where we think we might have bats roosting? How should we manage what level of disturbance may exist there for the bats that want to use those caves? And thankfully, there's already been some thoughts about how to do that, and I'll tell you about what that collaboration looks like right now. Most of the tools that exist for our collaboration are some of the ones that Shawn started way back when, and that's engaged open conversations at meetings like this, or sit down meetings like the World Cafe processes, and developing guidelines together to co-author management infographics like you see on this site, this page with Access Fund or management guidelines is huge for us. And then hopefully someday just develop surveys together about where we should be looking for bats and what that means for climbing activity in those areas. I wanted to take you through an area that we know that we have a climbing closure because of bats, and kind of illustrate what that looked like in this area of New York, Hales Cliff South. So some of you may be really familiar with this already, but Hales Cave was a tourist cave and is known to have white nose syndrome, the fungus that carries white nose syndrome, and the populations there were 1.16 thousand, but they're down to under 1,000. And this cave also is home to an endangered bat, the Indiana bat that Greg showed in his slide. And collaboratively, the climbing organization there and the state parks management agency kind of said, well, let's try a closure from November to April when the hibernation period is. And thankfully, because Thatcher Climbing Coalition was involved with that, it didn't seem to disrupt climbing activity much. First, in part because it's occurring during a time when climbing intensity is decreased. There's low winter climbing access. Some of the snow and ice along trails kind of limit the access there. They've already just developed a buffer around the cave opening of 100 feet on either side. And during the winter, this only affects, you kind of see from that top picture, that circle identifies where that cave location is. It only impacts 7 of the 75 routes in this whole area. So because of the timing and the weather conditions, it didn't seem to disrupt it much, and it's been a pretty collaborative process thus far. The more engaged writing activities for management guidelines are still in development. We developed a climbing guideline that we hope to have out this year with Access Fund and Bat Conservation International about what should we be thinking about for bat conservation as we develop routes or as climbers develop routes, and how we can manage those in the future. Very similar to the process for raptors, but again, not with the level of intensity, simply because bats don't seem to demonstrate the behavioral response the raptors do. But we have started focusing a management document to help climbing management organizations and wildlife management organizations think about what kind of buffers should occur around cave openings, because we know this is a resource that's used by bats. The bottom left picture is from a book where they kind of document where bats have existed in caves. And so on the far left of that is the opening of the cave, and as you go further right, where it gets grayer and darker, you go deeper into the cave, and all those little red dots are where they've identified different species existing. So you can sometimes have bats at the opening of a cave and deep inside a cave. And so there's a potential to disturb bats that you don't think you would, because they're existing at the opening, these areas where climbing could occur. Or if you're climbing deep in those, you could be disturbing ones deeper in. So some of the things that we talked about with climbers was, all right, how do we manage, camping near an open area? What level of activity and noise should be generated in those areas that could impact bats inside? How can we think about the drilling activity for route development, and whether or not that's even a persistent issue? Is it something that just happens once and bats don't care afterwards? But thankfully, from that, the climbers had an interest in helping us understand what that means. So we think it means something, but actually investigating what that means. And the bottom two slides are kind of buffer ideas that we had for what kind of distances should we limit that kind of, whether it be camping or smoke development, fire that could leak it into a cave opening. How could we structure those kind of buffers? And then tackling the thing that I always have dreamt about doing is, how can we get climbers out there looking for bats actively instead of just having them passively tell us where they see them? And so we were able to do this here in Colorado a couple of years ago with 2 student climbers in the bottom picture here, where they actively went out to areas near Boulder, Colorado, looking for bats without any prior knowledge. So what's the possibility if I go out there climbing and I really look, that I'd actually find bats? And they were able to climb 45 routes over a summer. And I'm going to play you some of their video as I talk. Is that over the 45 routes they visited, they found 2 routes with a bat in them. And they were, the aspect that was facing east. That may be just because that's the aspect of the rock itself and not what they're choosing. But both bats were 30 to 40 feet off the ground, relatively warm, in tight cracks. And finding 2 routes with bats doesn't sound like a lot. But when you think of the number of routes in Colorado, that could be up to 1,000 routes that have bat populations on them. And so that's a pretty dramatic speculation, but it's possible that there are bats existing in these systems and even off routes. So where we'd like to go in the future with this, Shawn alluded that we tried iNaturalist at the beginning to collect data. We think we have a more developed way of doing that, because we can actually ask more detailed information from climbers about, what does the crack look like? How wide was the crack? Was it a flake versus a crack or a pocket? There's more detailed information that we can ask. And so we've developed surveys online that allow not only climbers to submit data, but then view that data all over the world. Actually click on where climbers have seen bats, what the route was like, the pictures they've submitted of seeing bats. So we think this is going to be a really accessible way of looking at data and downloading data. And we hope to do more sit-down meetings like we did, we'll hope to do in Pennsylvania this year, maybe. And have CBC reps at a whole host of local climbing organizations. And again, my pie in the sky is to have a crew of biologist climbers that are out there looking for bats and following up on records. So I'm going to end it here, hoping that we have some time for questions, and I'll let Ken, you manage that and let me know where we are, and I'll stop sharing my slides.
Hey, that was great, Rob, and everybody. That what a great bit of information. Thank you, panelists. Very, very cool information. So let's we take some time for some questions from our audience. If Shawn, you could open that up. We have 5 minutes. I want to respect everybody's time tonight. Try to end right at 8 o'clock Eastern time. But if you have a lot of questions, we can go over. We don't mind. It's important stuff. So yeah. Anybody out there want to hit up our panelists with some questions? Go for it.
Greg, did you want to take Gabrielle's question to begin with in the chat?
Oh,
I
that
can
would
if you.
involve me. That would involve me opening the chat. I have to hold on.
I can take it if you
Gabby,
don't
there
want
we
to.
go. I live near Philly. Get bats in my house. Well, if you have bats in your house and it seems to be repeated, you probably have a maternity colony. That would be my first guess. A lot of times people have small maternity colonies. And when you notice those bats, I bet it's typically in late July, early August. And those are more often than not juveniles that are getting into trouble. They're crawling through different recesses and coming out in spots they didn't expect to. And so you probably want to do like what we would call like an evening emergence count and see where they come out, and you can count and join our Appalachian back count that way. And then sometimes, a little bit more rarely, we get people who report them in very early spring. Interestingly, I'm one of those people where I'd say every 2 to 3 years I get a bat in maybe March, sometimes April, but a little bit before the typical emergence on a warm day. All of a sudden a bat appears somewhere in my house. I was once greeted with a bat in my actual office in my house. I have a home office, by the way. Yeah, so we can get bats using sites in the winter and in the summer. And I would say more often than not, I'm more interested in the summer accounts with the Appalachian bat count, because the winter stuff is just very sporadic. So if you have a site and you actually do an evening watch, and on a nice warm day in the summer, and can confirm you have a colony, or your neighbors have a colony or something like that, we'd love to hear about it and have you join the Appalachian bat count.
So Greg, where exactly should we direct people to for that? Can you drop it in the link in the chat, or you can send it out afterwards? But
we'll figure out one of those two. I'll see if I can. I know on the Pennsylvania Game Commission website, if you go to the wildlife tab and click on any of the bats, it'll take you to what we call the bat page. And on there are a number of things. One of them's, want bats. The other one's got bats. And under, if you have bats, the Appalachian bat count is under there, but I'll help point you to that.
And Ken, I see John with his hand up, but I'm going to try and tackle Matthew's question real quick, and tell climbers in general, it's a great question about seeing species of bats and cracks, but it's really difficult to identify species with just a small frame of being able to see parts of those bats. So I don't expect climbers to be able to identify a lot of the bats they see. Just knowing bats are using an area can alert us to how we can do better monitoring techniques to determine what species and what numbers are there. John, did you want to?
Yeah, I've been climbing at High Rocks, a local area here. It's basically a compressed red shale. And honestly, I've never seen a sign of a bat. Are we just missing them? Do they favor one area or one type of habitat over another?
Great question. No, I've talked to a lot of climbers who have never seen bats while they climb, and I'll talk to some climbers who have seen multiple bats. So it runs the gamut. And I don't think there could be a resource they're selecting. We have yet to figure out exactly. We don't have enough data to identify what resources those are yet. But I'm hoping eventually, as this data comes in, is we'll be able to see that they are using resources, maybe like donation rocks where there's observations, or if you're climbing in one area and they haven't seen bats there, maybe there's some selection going on.
Okay, you don't know of a selection now as far as type of rock versus another.
No, the closest thing that we've been able to discover is that some of the repeat observations are flakes on south-facing slopes, at least here in the west, that get really hot. And so we think the maternity, these bats that are reproducing, like it when it's really warm. I say some maternity colonies get up to 125 degrees. So we think that they may be using these flakes, and climbers have told us about multiple aggregations of squeaking bats in these, and it's probably they're enjoying that heat, and that's where they're reproducing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hey, I'm going to jump back on here. It's 8 o'clock. I'm going to wrap it up, but anybody who wants to stay on, please stay on. This is great, good discussions. I just want to be with people that need to go off. Thank our panelists, Greg Turner, Shawn Davis, Rob Schorr, Ara Stauffer, and Matt Crosby. Thank you guys. Thanks to our audience. This has been really great, giving your time to us this evening on this really important topic. Recording of this presentation will be available to all who registered. You'll get a link sent to you via email. We'll also have it available to anyone via our your local climbing organizations, SWAPAC in the West, SCPC here in Central PA, and EPAC in the East. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. Climb on, climb safe, and watch for bats. So stay on if you all want, no problem, and glad to have you, and we'll keep going.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
And I'll stick around.
Yep.
Well, in the interim, Rob, I would agree with you on the solar component with maternity colonies. That's really key. But we've also been doing some really cool stuff with mitigation and producing sites for small-footed bats, which is our most prominent bat using sites. So we actually have companies, when they're causing disturbances, build these rock structures in the solar area like you talked about, where they're getting a lot of good warm temperatures. And that's really important for their energy demands of those females. So if you're a female bat and you only have so much energy in the spring and you're getting nights that are still dropping into the 30s, you know, having those warm places that warm up fast, that get that solar exposure, especially early in the morning, is really critical for them, that they spend less of their body energy on their fetus when they're cold, and they can spend more of it on it when they're warm. And so the faster they warm up, the faster their young grow. And so that's critical. But we also have sites, like we have a classic one, it's called Huntington Rocks, where it's basically just a small crevice. It starts off wide, maybe about 3 feet at the base, and just narrowly comes up. And you can't get more than a foot deep in there, but we'll catch thousands of bats before white nose syndrome going in there. And how deep those cracks go, you know, nobody knows, right? But there's stories of that over and over again. I know one of my counterparts in New York, he had a 2-inch by 4-inch crack that he drove by every day on his way home for years, for decades, and never knew it. And then all of a sudden one day he hit a bat on his way home in the late fall when it was dark. And he got out and he started noticing that bats were flying around and swarming. And he ended up finding a site that literally, with a small little crack in the hole, that the bats were swarming and going in. And it was limestone, so it was probably a deeper cave there, but something no human could access. And there were thousands of bats using that. And you know, it's just so hard to come across that. And if you're not looking for it, you're never going to find something like that. So that's kind of what your points were, I think, is just being vigilant, right?
Yeah, but understand. Go ahead, Dana.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to jump to another question.
No, I was going to say, yeah, the resources that bats use, they're scales that we as humans don't typically think of. So, you know, centimeter wide cracks are plenty big enough for bats to come in and out of, and who knows how large that structure is inside. And so you can have populations that exist in what seem like meaningless resource cracks, but could be really valuable for bats that we're still learning about, thanks to climbers.
So what I was going to say is there's a question about volunteering in the chat, and we know we talked about wanting to do a bigger, maybe the World Cafe style meeting at some point, but sort of in the interim between this and that, like what are next steps? What are things that we could start working on here in Pennsylvania? And if there's folks that want to volunteer or help out or bring together, you know, some more conversations around this, what would you all suggest?
So I get this question a lot, and I love the energy for volunteerism, but I also appreciate that not everybody has that kind of time all the time. And so the best thing that I always advocate for is sharing what you've learned through talks like this about the value of bats, the contribution climbers can make for us understanding bat biology, and the valuable contributions they make for us understanding how to approach conservation for bats. So that's a great starting point. And then if we do get these meetings together, just come to those, is that bring friends of yours that have interest in conservation and climbing, because Shawn can attest to this, is that we had a very gradual growth process because we want it to be an engagement-based learning experience. We didn't want to flood the environment with this idea of, oh, we want your data, without them understanding why we want those data. So we have purposely been hosting sit-down meetings where we get this level of interaction that people really understand why we want the data we want without the fear that we're going to use it in different ways. So that's not a great answer for how you volunteer right now, simply because I don't have the structure to figure out how to deploy people in areas yet. Ideally, when we get to the point where we can have local climbing area representatives who understand biology and can advocate for this, we'd have volunteers at each of these LCOs talking about bats and sharing it with their friends, and then them be the hub for getting submissions to the website.
Rob, I would add to that we already brought up the Appalachian bat count that, we're always looking for those summer maternity colonies, whether it be, small-footed bats in a rock cliff or little browns, in an old house on the side of a river, whatever the case may be, bats in a barn. We're always looking for those sites, and we're always looking for people to monitor them. And they're easy things to do, where like with our Appalachian bat count, we're talking 2 counts per year, and it provides really critical, information on, we have one with just the adults before the young are born and one after. And that allows us to track how well reproduction's occurring with these guys. And so we have that program up and running. And then there's also a whole national program, the NA BAT. When you mentioned a hub, it made me think of that. So NA BAT has these little bat hubs, but they have a lot of people that volunteer doing acoustic routes where you can go to certain places, and NA BAT would hook people up with that, where they can actually borrow acoustic gear. You just kind of like magnetically attach it to your computer and drive around on a route and just do that periodically and submit that data. And all of these little bits of data, compile up and really help.
I wanted to post one other question that was in the chat. I think Bria, who posted it, might have already left. However, they want to know if bat boxes help because they've hung up some bat boxes.
Most common question I get is that how can bat boxes help? And I think they can be great resources for roosting bats. The struggle that I've always had, and Greg, you can chime in here too, is being able to predict where to put those. It's not always easy to predict where those are going to be used best. And they might be used by different age groups, different sexes in different ways. And so I think they can be valuable, but don't be too discouraged if your first placement doesn't attract a lot of bats.
Yeah, that's spot on. You get certain bat species that switch roosts every couple days. And if they come in for one night and use it, it's hard to really know. And placement is really critical for the species that really aggregate, like little browns and Indiana bats. You really need to have a really good location, usually with a lot of solar exposure, which is something that Rob hit in on. That these bats like it 100 to 120 degrees, and that's a little bit warmer than you would probably normally think. And so we have guidelines that help with our bat box placement. We paint them black. We have the face of the box facing where the sun will come up in the morning. You want to place it on the western side of a field, for example, versus the eastern. So it really maximizes that solar exposure. And again, there's other species that don't need that solar exposure and want variation, and they move around more. But So there's a lot of different ways that bats are using these boxes. And we've used them as an agency. Whenever we found very large maternity colonies in the past, we put these up in the area, and we don't expect them to be used right away. Sometimes it takes a decade or more for them to be used. And so patience is a big key there. A great example is my colleague. He put bat boxes up, and he had them up for 5-6 years and never had a bat in there. And then all of a sudden, about a mile away, the landowner did a big forestry project. And next thing he knows, he had a colony of bats, about 30 or 40 that moved in. And once he had a little bit of bat use, that attracted more bats. And within about 5 years, he had over 1,000 bats using his bat box. But it took a long time to get there. And so patience is the key.
And Bria, if you are watching this and you watch the recording later, is that I found using older material, older building material is better than using new material. Some of the chemicals and some of the wood structures can, I think, preclude them from finding it or using it as readily. But whereas I've seen old barn wood used much more readily sometimes than newer materials. And the idea of placing them in a particular direction can be regional. I know in Arizona and New Mexico, you place them on the south-facing slopes, they can get too hot. And so they can find that they just aren't used because the temperature gets too warm. So this is regional. It's going to be species specific. It's going to be sex specific, age specific. So unfortunately, bats are so secretive. We're still learning about how best to do this.
Good points, Rob. And the grip is one of the biggest things. So when we make our bat boxes, just if anyone out there is going to make one, we use rough cut hemlock for two reasons. One, it's rough and they get a really easy grip. So if it's slippery wood, they're not going to use it ever. So if we originally, when we first started making these, we would scar up plywood to no end. I mean, we found every way we could think of to roughen plywood, including tying it to the back of the bumper and driving down the road for 10 miles. And rough cut hemlock just comes so perfectly roughened and grippy that those bats can just stick right to it. But hemlock and some of the conifers offer another advantage in that they don't warp as much. And so using cheap materials, they warp, and you're wasting your time more than your money when it comes to that. And then you want to be careful that you don't go with cedar, because cedar actually will repel bats. So our recommendation is rough cut wood or really old wood like barn wood or something like that, that just spend little time making it super grippy, and you'll have a lot more success that way.
I think that might be it for the questions, I guess, unless anybody else wants to chime in. Dana, is there any more questions in the chat room?
No, I think we hit most of them. And I dropped my email in the chat for folks that want to keep in touch on this. I can put together, a contact list, and that way, if we have next steps or folks that are interested in talking about this again or helping to create those next steps, then we can make sure to keep in touch on that.
That's great. Okay, well, I guess we'll make it an official wrap. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Really, really appreciate it.